didn't happen under flashing lights, no raised voices, no dramatic refusal, no security guard puffing his chest for the cameras. Just a pause. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. A glance down at a tablet, and a sentence that landed with a dull procedural finality. You're not cleared to enter. That's it. That was the moment. And here's the part that should bother you right away. This wasn't said to an anonymous guest. It wasn't said to someone who wandered into the wrong entrance. It wasn't said to a fan hoping for a selfie. It was said to Meghan Markle at Paris Fashion Week in 2026. If that feels jarring, good. It should. Because everything we think we understand about celebrity, access, power, and inevitability tells us that moments like this aren't supposed to happen. Not anymore. Not at this level. Not in this room. And yet, they do. Quietly. Almost politely. That's what makes this story different. Because this isn't about fashion. And it isn't really about security either. This is about how power actually works when no one is watching. About who gets waved through velvet ropes and who, suddenly, doesn't. Ask yourself something before we go any further. When was the last time you saw someone like her be told no in a space built entirely on visibility? Not criticized, not mocked, not debated on social media, denied, no explanation, no appeal, no spectacle. Just stopped. What happened outside that venue in Paris didn't explode in real time. It didn't trend immediately. It didn't come with a viral clip or a shouted confrontation. In fact, if you weren't physically there or directly connected to someone who was, you might not have noticed anything at all. That's important, because the most consequential shifts in status rarely announce themselves. They slip in quietly, disguised as logistics, as protocols, as misunderstandings that no one rushes to correct. Paris Fashion Week, for all its glamour, is built on that kind of silence. The kind that decides everything long before a camera ever turns on. By the time Meghan arrived that day, the decisions had already been made. The lists had already been finalized. The thresholds had already been set. She just didn't know yet that she was on the wrong side of one. Now, let's slow this down. Because the temptation, especially online, is to flatten moments like this into a single explanation. To say it was a snub, or a mistake, or a security overreach, or even a setup. But that instinct misses the point. This wasn't chaos. It was order. And order only feels shocking when you realize you're no longer at the center of it. Think about how Paris Fashion Week actually functions. Not the version you see on Instagram or TikTok, where celebrities drift between shows and photographers call their names like currency. The real version operates more like a diplomatic summit than a party. Access isn't about fame alone. It's about alignment, timing, risk, and usefulness. Every major show runs on layers of permission that never make it into glossy recaps. Invitations are negotiated, revised, withdrawn. Security lists are cross-checked. Final approvals come down to the wire, sometimes hours before doors open. And once those doors open, there are no improvisations. That's the rule no one likes to talk about, because improvisation is dangerous at this level. It introduces variables, and variables are the one thing institutions built on image control cannot tolerate. So when security looked down at that screen and hesitated, it wasn't because they were confused. It was because something didn't match. A name, a credential, an expectation. And when the pause stretched just a little too long, the outcome was already locked in. Here's where the emotional contradiction creeps in. From the outside, Meghan Markle still represents global recognition. She's photographed, discussed, analyzed. Her presence still carries symbolic weight. She still moves headlines simply by arriving somewhere. But inside systems like this, systems that don't care about public narratives, symbolism only matters if it serves the structure. And in 2026, that calculation had changed. You can feel it in the way witnesses later described the moment, not as explosive, not as humiliating in a loud way, but as something colder, contained. She didn't argue, according to people nearby. She didn't demand a supervisor. There was no scene to film, just a brief exchange followed by a stillness that drew more attention than shouting ever could. That stillness is what you need to pay attention to. Because stillness is what happens when someone realizes in real time that the leverage they thought they had isn't being recognized anymore. Ask yourself another uncomfortable question. How many times in history has status disappeared not with a fall, but with a pause? We're conditioned to expect collapses, scandals, explosions. But most losses of access don't look like that. They look like doors that simply don't open. And here's the unsettling part. No one rushed to fix it. No frantic staffer appeared to smooth things over. No backstage intervention materialized. No quiet apology followed her down the sidewalk. That absence tells you more than any official statement ever could. Because in environments like Paris Fashion Week, mistakes are corrected instantly, if the person involved still matters to the machine. This wasn't corrected, which means, at least in that moment, it wasn't considered a mistake. Now zoom out for a second. Why does this matter beyond one denied entry? Because moments like this reveal the truth behind the illusion we're sold about modern celebrity. The idea that once you reach a certain level, access becomes permanent. That recognition compounds endlessly. That doors only open wider over time. That's a comforting myth. It keeps the hierarchy looking fluid. Democratic, even, but elite systems don't operate on permanence. They operate on relevance. And relevance is not something you declare about yourself. It's something other people quietly decide, often without telling you. In the years leading up to 2026, fashion houses became increasingly risk-averse. Not publicly. Publicly, they preached inclusion, boldness, disruption, but privately, they tracked sentiment like a stock price. Every association weighed, every name assessed for volatility. This wasn't about personal feelings, it was about cost-benefit calculations. And somewhere along the line, someone decided that allowing her through that door carried more risk than reward. That's the part people struggle with. The idea that exclusion can be bureaucratic, that denial doesn't have to be cruel to be absolute. It can be polite, efficient, final. Witnesses later said the exchange lasted less than a minute. But psychologically, those seconds stretch, especially when you're used to being expected, especially when you're used to systems bending just a little in your favor. The irony is hard to miss. Paris Fashion Week thrives on the illusion of rebellion, of breaking norms, of challenging old power structures. Yet when confronted with uncertainty, it defaults to the oldest instinct of all, protect the gate. And the gate held. At this point, you might be wondering, was this really about her? Or was she simply the visible edge of a much larger recalibration happening behind the scenes? That's the right question. Because what unfolded next didn't stay contained to that sidewalk. It rippled outward through publicists, through brand conversations, through internal emails that were never meant to be seen. And it exposed something far more uncomfortable than a denied invitation. It exposed the fragility of assumed access. The truth is, no one loses relevance all at once. It erodes, quietly, one unanswered message at a time. One invitation that doesn't arrive, one door that stays closed just long enough for you to realize you're no longer expected on the other side. Paris didn't start this process, but it made it visible. And the reason this story matters now, not years from now, not in retrospect, is because this moment marked a shift from speculation to confirmation, from whispers to enforcement, from soft distancing to hard boundaries. Because once security says no, everyone else falls in line. And the most revealing detail of all, the denial didn't come from a rival, or a critic, or even a vocal opponent. It came from a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Which raises a question that no one involved has answered publicly. Who decided she no longer belonged on that list? And why did no one feel the need to explain? Because what happened next after she stepped away from that entrance would make it clear this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a signal. And once you recognize it as one, the rest of the story starts to look very different. So let's stay right there, at the edge of the entrance, at the point where expectation met resistance and didn't win. Because the first thing that matters about what happened next is how ordinary it looked to everyone else. People kept moving. Cameras kept clicking. Cars kept pulling up and pulling away. Paris Fashion Week doesn't pause for confusion. It absorbs it. And that's exactly what made the moment so destabilizing. If you were standing 10 feet away, you might have missed it entirely. A slight change in posture, a security officer shifting his weight, a glance exchanged between two people trained not to react emotionally to anything. Then, the subtle choreography of refusal. No crossed arms, no raised voice, no step forward that would have signaled confrontation. Just a boundary being enforced. And here's the first uncomfortable question you should sit with. When systems deny access at this level, why do they always feel so calm about it? The answer isn't cruelty, it's confidence. Security didn't look uncertain because uncertainty had already been resolved somewhere else. This wasn't a decision being made. It was a decision being executed. The denial happened at a side entrance, not the most visible one, but not hidden either. A place designed for controlled arrivals, close enough to the action to matter, far enough away to avoid chaos, the kind of entrance reserved for people who are expected but not necessarily announced. Which is why this moment hit so hard. Because she arrived like someone who belonged there. Not late, not flustered, not improvising. Everything about the arrival suggested pre-clearance. That's what witnesses noticed first. The confidence, the lack of hesitation. The assumption that this was just another threshold to cross. And assumptions, as it turns out, are fragile things. Security protocols at Paris Fashion Week don't operate on recognition, they operate on verification. Names, credentials, clearance windows, updated lists that refresh constantly as schedules shift. That tablet wasn't decorative. It was decisive. And when the name didn't resolve the way it was supposed to, the system defaulted to denial. That's not personal. It's structural. But structure doesn't soften impact. The first response wasn't no, it was silence. A pause long enough to signal friction, but short enough to avoid drawing attention. Then the sentence, "You're not cleared to enter." No apology, no explanation, and that detail matters more than people realize. Because in elite spaces, explanations are currency. They're offered when someone still deserves reassurance, when someone is still inside the circle of concern. This refusal didn't come with one. Instead, there was a suggestion, not verbalized, but implied, that if this was an error, someone else would correct it. That if this was a misunderstanding, it wasn't security's problem to solve. Which raises the next question, why didn't anyone step in? Publicists live for moments like this. They exist to smooth edges, to make awkwardness evaporate before it registers. Yet no fixer materialized, no whisper of, 1 second we'll sort this, just containment. People nearby noticed something else too. Not anger, not embarrassment, but a recalibration, a brief tightening around the eyes, the kind of expression that appears when someone realizes the script they were operating from no longer applies. Because this wasn't supposed to happen this way. In the past, even tension came with negotiation. A delay, maybe, a reroute, a compromise. This time, there was none. The denial stood on its own. If you've ever watched power shift in real time, you'll recognize that moment. The instant when someone understands that pushing would only make things worse. That pressing the issue would turn a quiet refusal into a visible one. And so the choice becomes internal. Do you escalate and risk spectacle? Or do you retreat and preserve dignity? Witnesses say she chose the second. And that choice, paradoxically, made the moment louder. Because when someone used to deference accepts denial without protest, it tells everyone watching that the hierarchy has already changed. Here's something people don't like to admit about Paris Fashion Week. Security doesn't act alone. They enforce instructions that originate far from the door. Sometimes days earlier, sometimes weeks. Access lists are built collaboratively. Brands submit preferences. Organizers reconcile conflicts. Final authority rests with a small group whose names never appear in programs or press releases. Once those lists are locked, flexibility disappears. And on that day, the list didn't bend. Think about how rare that is. High-profile guests are often added last minute. Exceptions are made quietly. Someone forgot to RSVP but is waved through anyway. That didn't happen here, which suggests something more intentional than oversight. But intent doesn't always mean hostility. Sometimes it means risk avoidance. Sometimes it means fatigue. Sometimes it means someone somewhere decided the cost of association had quietly tipped out of her favor. And that decision didn't need to be announced. It just needed to be enforced once. That's all it takes. The crowd didn't gasp. No phones flew up to capture the drama. That's the other irony. Moments like this are often invisible precisely because they're designed to be. Paris Fashion Week knows how to hide its mechanisms. Yet word spread anyway. Not instantly, not explosively, but in murmurs, in sideways glances, in the subtle change in how people nearby behaved afterward. Because everyone in that ecosystem understands what a denied entry means. It doesn't mean not today. It means Not like this anymore. And that's the line no one crosses casually. As she stepped back from the entrance, the door didn't reopen. There was no second check, no quiet phone call to double confirm. The process moved on. That's another thing people underestimate about elite systems. They don't dwell, they progress. And progression is merciless. Within minutes, the show schedule took over. Guests were ushered inside. The event unfolded exactly as planned, just without her. If this were a movie, this is where the confrontation would happen, where someone storms back in, where authority is challenged and reversed. Real life doesn't do that. Real life lets moments like this stand unresolved, which brings us to something deeply uncomfortable: the absence of witnesses willing to intervene. People who had greeted her earlier that day didn't rush over. People who would have once vouched didn't suddenly appear. Not because they didn't care, but because association itself had become uncertain. And uncertainty is contagious. In spaces like this, the first instinct isn't solidarity, it's self-preservation. No one wants to be seen pushing against a closed gate unless they're certain they won't be the next one locked out. So the silence held. And in that silence, a recalibration rippled outward. What makes this moment so telling is not that it happened, but that it held. Security didn't receive a follow-up instruction to let her through. No higher authority overruled the decision. No apology came later. That tells us something critical. The denial aligned with expectations higher up the chain, which means this wasn't a spontaneous judgment. It was the final step of a longer process, a process that likely began long before Paris, long before that sidewalk, long before that tablet. And here's where the story deepens, because Paris Fashion Week 22/6 was not an isolated event. It was a convergence point, a place where multiple narratives intersected: fashion, celebrity, politics, reputation. And reputations, once they tip into volatility, don't recover through presence alone. They require permission. The permission to be seen without risk. The permission to occupy space without explanation. That permission, on that day, was missing. And the most revealing part? No one tried to explain why. No spokesperson rushed to clarify. No anonymous source offered a quick fix to the press. The industry didn't deny it happened. It simply didn't acknowledge it, which is often worse. Because denial can be argued with. Silence cannot. This is where the story stops being about a door and starts being about a system that had quietly adjusted its thresholds, a system that had recalculated who was worth accommodating, a system that, when confronted with a mismatch between fame and function, chose function. And once a system does that, it rarely reverses course. So ask yourself this as we move forward: if this wasn't a mistake, what changed? What conversations happened before this moment that made the denial feel justified? Who had already decided the outcome before she arrived? Because the truth is, doors like that don't close themselves. They're closed by people, often people you never see, operating on assumptions that feel invisible until you're on the wrong side of them. And in Paris, that assumption had already hardened. What happened next would make it clear that this wasn't just about one entrance or one show or one day. It was about a recalibration that was already underway. And once it began, it didn't stop at the door. Was this really about one door? Or was that door just the first place where a much bigger rule finally showed itself? Because once you step back from the moment itself, the tablet, the pause, the refusal, something else becomes impossible to ignore. Paris Fashion Week didn't malfunction that day. It performed exactly as designed. And that's where most people misunderstand what they're watching. Paris Fashion Week is often described as chaos wrapped in couture, a frenzy of arrivals, egos, photographers shouting names like spells. But that version exists mostly for the cameras. The real structure underneath is closer to an airport security system crossed with a diplomatic summit. Everything looks fluid, almost improvisational. Nothing is. Access at Paris Fashion Week is not about fame in the abstract. It's about function, about whether your presence stabilizes or destabilizes the environment the brands are trying to curate. And that calculation happens long before the doors open. Here's the uncomfortable truth that rarely makes it into glossy profiles. Paris Fashion Week doesn't reward relevance the way the public understands it. It rewards predictability, the ability to arrive, sit, be photographed, and leave without introducing risk. Risk can mean scandal. Risk can mean distraction. Risk can mean headlines that don't align with the narrative a house wants to sell that season. And in 22/6, risk tolerance had dropped sharply, not publicly, of course. Publicly, fashion spoke the language of boldness and disruption. Privately, it had entered a phase of consolidation. Fewer surprises, fewer wild cards, fewer names that required explanation. That's not an opinion. That's a shift multiple insiders quietly acknowledged after the season wrapped. The guest lists were tighter, the security protocols stricter, the margin for improvisation thinner than it had been in years. So when someone arrived assuming recognition would carry them through, they were operating on an outdated model of how this world works. And outdated models are punished not loudly, but efficiently. Paris Fashion Week operates on tiers: official invitees, approved guests, conditional guests. Each tier comes with a different level of scrutiny. And then there's a category no one likes to name: people who used to belong, but now require justification. That's the most dangerous position of all, because justification invites debate, and debate invites risk. So institutions avoid it. They don't argue, they don't explain. They simply don't extend access. Think about how many celebrities attend Paris Fashion Week every year without incident. Think about how many glide through entrances unnoticed because their presence aligns seamlessly with expectations. Now think about how few are ever visibly denied. That rarity is the point. Security denials are not common. They're last resort expressions of a decision already ratified elsewhere, which is why the denial that day felt so absolute. No one on the ground behaved as if there was a chance of reversal. Not security, not staff, not the people coordinating arrivals, because they already knew where this stood. And this is where the idea of fashion snub falls apart. A snub implies intent to embarrass. It implies a social slight, a message delivered with malice. This wasn't that, this was administrative, which makes it far more consequential. Administrative decisions don't need to be defended. They're protected by process, by procedure, by the language of policy. You can't argue with a locked list. You can't negotiate with a clearance window that's closed. You can't charm a protocol. And Paris Fashion Week thrives on that immunity. The irony is that the public-facing version of the event sells spontaneity, front-row surprises, unexpected appearances, viral moments. But those moments only happen when they're approved, when they're safe, when they've been quietly absorbed into the structure ahead of time. Nothing truly unexpected makes it past the door. That's the part people don't like to hear. So when that door didn't open, it wasn't rejecting a person. It was enforcing a boundary that had already been drawn. And that boundary had less to do with personality than with optics. By 2026, fashion houses were no longer chasing attention at any cost. Attention had become cheap, volatile, hard to control. What they wanted instead was alignment. Alignment with brand values. Alignment with long-term partnerships. Alignment with narratives that didn't require footnotes. And anyone who brought footnotes into the room became a question mark. That's not personal. But it feels personal when you're the one standing outside. Let's talk about how lists actually work, because this is where the myth of chaos collapses completely. Every major Paris Fashion Week venue operates with multiple overlapping lists: brand lists, venue lists, organizer lists, security lists. These lists are reconciled constantly, sometimes up until the final hour. But reconciliation doesn't mean inclusion, it means resolution. Conflicts are settled by prioritization. Who matters more to the event's goals? Who introduces the least friction? Who adds value without complication? Once that hierarchy is established, the list locks. And once it locks, it doesn't reopen. This is why last-minute arrivals are so revealing. They test the integrity of the system. They force it to show whether it's flexible or firm. In this case, it was firm. And firmness is never accidental. The denial didn't spark outrage among insiders because insiders recognized it as a signal, not a mistake. A signal that the system was tightening, that it was drawing sharper lines, that it was less willing to bend for anyone whose presence required interpretation. You might be thinking, but hasn't fashion always courted controversy? Yes, when controversy could be framed as avant-garde. But there's a difference between curated provocation and unpredictable fallout. One sells collections, the other creates headlines that brands don't control. And control in 22/6 was everything. That's why this moment matters beyond one individual. It reveals a recalibration happening across elite spaces. Who gets access is no longer just about who you are. It's about how easily you fit into the machine. And machines don't like friction. They like predictability. They like guests who show up, pose, leave, and generate exactly the coverage expected. Anything else is a liability. So when security enforced that boundary, they weren't being rude, they were being precise. Which brings us back to the quietness of the moment. If this were about punishment, it would have been louder. If this were about humiliation, it would have been visible. But this was about correction, about restoring a perceived balance. And corrections are always quiet. They don't announce themselves because they don't want debate. They just happen. The most telling reaction that day wasn't hers. It was everyone else's. No one seemed surprised. No whispers of "this can't be right." No visible shock, just an acceptance that something had shifted. And acceptance, in elite circles, is often the final stage of a decision that's been brewing for a long time. By the time the public hears about it, it's already over. Which raises a deeper question: how long had this been coming? How many small signals preceded this moment that went unnoticed because they didn't fit the narrative of endless access? An invitation that never arrived. A seat that wasn't front row anymore. A brand that stopped returning calls. Individually, those things mean nothing. Together, they form a pattern. And patterns are what institutions respond to. Paris Fashion Week didn't invent that pattern. It recognized it, and once recognized, it acted. That's why the denial felt so clean, so final, so unburdened by emotion. Because emotion wasn't part of the calculation, which leaves us with an uncomfortable realization. If Paris Fashion Week, an event built on spectacle, was willing to deny entry this quietly, what does that say about how many other doors had already closed without anyone noticing? And more importantly, who was involved in making sure this one stayed shut? Because the door wasn't guarded by fashion editors or designers. It was guarded by security enforcing instructions they didn't create. Instructions that came from somewhere else, somewhere higher, somewhere quieter. And once those instructions are issued, no amount of recognition can override them. The denial wasn't the story. It was the confirmation. And what came next would make it clear that this recalibration didn't stop with Paris. It was already moving. So now the question shifts. Not what happened at the door, but why her name wasn't where it was supposed to be in the first place. Because here's the thing no one says out loud at events like Paris Fashion Week. Names don't disappear accidentally. They're removed or deprioritized or quietly downgraded until they no longer trigger access at all. And that process almost never starts at the entrance. It starts weeks earlier, in inboxes no one sees. The list. People like to imagine the list as a single document, a neat spreadsheet, a master record, something definitive. It isn't. It's layered, fragmented, constantly revised. There's the brand's preferred list, the organizer's approved list, the venue's security list, and then the final operational list, the one security actually enforces. That last one is the only list that matters. And once a name doesn't resolve there, everything upstream becomes irrelevant. What's striking about this situation is not just that her name didn't trigger access, it's that no one on the ground treated that absence as an anomaly. No one said, "That's strange." No one said, "She should be here." No one scrambled to reconcile the discrepancy, because discrepancies had already been resolved. Somewhere between the early invitations and the final security pass, a decision had been made about where she belonged in the hierarchy of that event, or whether she belonged at all. Here's where things get uncomfortable. Paris Fashion Week is not democratic. It doesn't care about fairness. It cares about coherence, about minimizing friction between brand narratives, sponsor expectations, press coverage, and internal politics. Every guest is evaluated not just on who they are, but on what they bring with them. And by 22/6, what she brought had become complicated. Not universally negative, not toxic in the simplistic way critics like to frame things, but layered, context-heavy, difficult to control, the kind of presence that generates conversation instead of consensus. Fashion doesn't mind conversation when it's about clothes, or art, or innovation. It becomes wary when the conversation shifts elsewhere. That shift had already happened. And once it happens, the calculus changes. The list reflects that calculus. It's not punitive, it's preventative, which is why her name didn't need to be crossed out dramatically. It just needed to stop being prioritized. Stop being flagged, stop being protected. Think about how many celebrities rely on informal recognition to move through spaces like this. The nod, the she's fine, the assumption that someone else has already approved them, which is why this moment sent a quiet shockwave through people paying attention. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was definitive. No one rushed to reinterpret it. No one framed it as confusion. It landed exactly as intended. As a boundary, and boundaries, once enforced, tend to multiply. This is where the emotional contradiction sharpens. From the outside, she still occupied enormous cultural space, articles, commentary, ongoing fascination. But inside elite systems, cultural noise is less important than operational clarity. The question becomes simple. Does this presence complicate or streamline? And someone decided the answer leaned the wrong way. It's tempting to look for a single trigger, a single incident, a single reason. That's rarely how this works. It's cumulative. A reputation doesn't tip because of one thing. It tips because of accumulation, of unpredictability, of fatigue, of associations that require explanation instead of amplifying the brand's message. And once that tipping point is reached, the correction doesn't come with warnings. It comes with enforcement, which brings us back to the list. The list isn't personal, but being removed from it feels intensely so, because it strips away the illusion that access is earned forever. It reminds everyone watching that no one is indispensable. Not to fashion, not to institutions, not to systems that prioritize continuity over loyalty. The denial at the door was just the visible end of that process. The invisible part happened quietly, earlier, when someone asked a question that changed everything. Do we need to account for her? And the answer, this time, was no. That answer didn't require a press release. It didn't require justification. It just required consistency. And consistency is exactly what followed. Which leads to the next layer of this story, the one that makes people most uneasy. Because once a name stops triggering access in one place, it often stops triggering it elsewhere. Lists talk to each other. Institutions observe each other. Signals propagate. Paris didn't operate in isolation. It reflected a broader recalibration already underway. And what happened after this denial, the reactions, the silences, the subtle shifts in behavior, would confirm that this was not a one-off. It was a marker, a moment when the invisible became briefly visible, and one scene impossible to ignore, because the list wasn't just missing a name. It was redefining who still belonged, and that redefinition was only beginning. Who decides when someone stops being expected? That's the question that starts to surface once you accept that the list didn't malfunction, it obeyed. Because lists don't generate themselves. They're built, curated, negotiated, and then, at a certain point, locked. Which means someone, somewhere, had already moved her from assumed presence to conditional, and then from conditional to something more final. Not banned, just unnecessary. That distinction matters more than people realize. Being banned is loud. It invites challenge. It creates sides. Being unnecessary is quiet. It closes doors without confrontation. And that quiet is what followed her after Paris. Let's talk about expectations, because that's where this really breaks. At events like this, arrival is rarely questioned. People who belong don't think about entry. They think about timing, about cameras, about seating. When you stop thinking about access, you're already inside the system. And the moment access becomes visible again, when you suddenly have to negotiate it, something has already shifted. Witnesses described the seconds after the refusal as oddly suspended, not tense in the way arguments are tense. More like the air had thickened. Conversations nearby softened. People instinctively looked away. Because no one wants to be present when the hierarchy reveals itself. That revelation is uncomfortable for everyone. It reminds those inside that inclusion is conditional, and it reminds those outside that proximity doesn't equal protection. What's striking is how quickly the environment reasserted itself. Within moments, attention redirected. Guests flowed inward. The event continued. Paris Fashion Week didn't absorb the disruption. It ignored it. That's the difference. Absorption acknowledges. Ignoring erases. And erasure is the cleanest form of control. Later, people would say things like, "It was handled discreetly," or "There was no incident." Both are true. And both are misleading, because discretion doesn't mean neutrality. It means intent. Someone intended for this to pass without spectacle. And it did. Which brings us to the next contradiction. Public narratives thrive on conflict, on villains, on visible tension. But elite systems don't. They thrive on compliance. And compliance doesn't require agreement. It just requires acceptance. She accepted the refusal. Security enforced it. Everyone else moved on. That's compliance. Not because anyone wanted it, but because challenging it would have exposed more than anyone was willing to risk. Here's something people who've worked around fashion weeks understand intuitively. The worst thing you can be is unpredictable, not controversial, not disliked, unpredictable. Unpredictability forces institutions to prepare explanations, to manage fallout, to divert resources. And by 22/6, institutions were tired of being reactive, tired of being dragged into narratives they didn't control, tired of being asked to take sides. So they tightened. Not publicly, privately. They leaned into safety, into consistency, into guests who could be slotted into coverage without disclaimers. And anyone who complicated that equation, even unintentionally, found themselves slowly deprioritized. This is how exclusion happens in modern elite spaces. Not through confrontation, but through recalibration. The recalibration had already happened before Paris. Paris just enforced it. There's another layer here that's easy to miss if you focus only on her. This wasn't just about removing one person from a list. It was about redefining the list itself, who it was for, what it represented, and what risks it was willing to absorb. Fashion in this period was retreating from spectacle as chaos and moving towards spectacle as control. Everything looked the same on the surface, the clothes, the venues, the parties. But beneath that surface, thresholds hardened. The idea that fame alone could override institutional caution was becoming obsolete, which is why this moment landed so cleanly. No apologies, no backtracking. The system behaved as if it had already rehearsed this outcome, and that rehearsal didn't start with her arrival. It started when her presence began to require explanation. That's the turning point no one likes to acknowledge. The moment when someone goes from being self-evident to being contextual. Once that happens, every invitation becomes a decision instead of a default. And defaults are where power hides. Paris Fashion Week stripped away the default, and when it did, it revealed something else: the absence of advocacy. People assume that behind the scenes, powerful figures pull strings, that if someone truly matters, someone else will intervene. But intervention requires incentive, and in this case, the incentive had evaporated. No one stepped forward to argue for inclusion because no one wanted to argue against the system's logic. Because that logic wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as alignment. And alignment is hard to oppose without positioning yourself as misaligned. So silence prevailed. That silence didn't just protect the organizers. It protected everyone watching. Because if the system could quietly deny her, it could deny anyone. And no one wants to test that boundary. What followed in the hours after the denial is telling. There was no scramble to control the narrative, no urgent outreach to journalists, no attempt to spin the moment into something else. Because spin only works when there's something to counter. Here, there was nothing. No footage, no confrontation, no official comment, just a door that didn't open. And doors that don't open rarely make headlines unless someone forces them to. She didn't. Which, again, preserved dignity, but also preserved the system. That choice matters. Because it allowed the denial to function exactly as intended, as a quiet marker rather than a public rupture. And markers, unlike ruptures, influence behavior long after the moment passes. People noticed. Not the public at first, but insiders. They noticed who wasn't there. They noticed that no one seemed concerned. They noticed that nothing was corrected. And they adjusted accordingly. That's how influence spreads in these environments. Through observation, through pattern recognition, through reading what isn't said. Paris Fashion Week didn't need to announce a new rule. It demonstrated one, and demonstrations are more powerful than declarations. The rule was simple. Access is no longer assumed. And once that rule is demonstrated at a door, it echoes far beyond that space. The next invitations become cautious. The next conversations more guarded. The next decisions already informed. which is why this moment didn't end when she stepped away from the entrance. It followed her into subsequent interactions, into the way calls were returned or weren't, into the way her presence was recalculated elsewhere. The denial was a data point, and data points accumulate. The question now isn't whether Paris was justified. The question is what Paris reflected, because institutions rarely move alone. They mirror each other, they observe each other, they take cues from each other, and when one enforces a boundary without consequence, others notice. Which brings us to the next shift in this story. Because Paris wasn't the only place where assumptions were tested. It was just the first place where the answer came back unequivocally clear. And what happened next, in rooms far from runways, would confirm that this was not an isolated recalibration. It was a pattern asserting itself. And once patterns assert themselves, they don't retreat quietly, they expand. If you're still thinking this was about fashion, this is where that idea finally falls apart. Because the most important reactions didn't happen on that sidewalk. They happened later, in rooms she wasn't in, on calls she wasn't part of, in conversations that didn't need her name spoken out loud to revolve around her. That's how influence actually works at this level. Not through confrontation, but through recalculation. The denial created a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. Within hours, people who hadn't been present began to hear about it, not as gossip, but as information, the kind that travels without drama, the kind that's framed as just so you know. Those are the most dangerous words in elite circles. Just so you know, she didn't get in. Just so you know, security didn't budge. Just so you know, no one intervened. Each repetition stripped the moment of ambiguity and replaced it with clarity, because ambiguity invites debate. Clarity invites adjustment, and adjustment is exactly what followed. Here's something insiders understand instinctively. When a system enforces a boundary without resistance, it signals confidence, and confidence attracts alignment. People don't ask whether the system was right, they ask what the system now expects. So they adapt. The denial became a reference point, not something to challenge, but something to account for. And once something becomes something to account for, it changes behavior. Invitations that were being considered suddenly needed review. Appearances that might have happened quietly were reconsidered. Associations that once felt neutral began to feel weighted, not because of outrage, because of caution. This is how relevance erodes in modern power structures. Not through backlash, but through risk assessment. Someone somewhere asked a question that no one wanted to answer publicly. Do we want to be the ones who make this complicated? And when that question is asked often enough, the answer starts to default to no. That's not rejection, it's retreat. What makes this moment so revealing is how little effort anyone made to counteract it. No one rushed to reassure. No one planted stories to smooth the optics. Because reassurance would have required acknowledging that something was wrong. And from the system's perspective, nothing was. The denial aligned with the internal logic already in place, which means Paris didn't create a problem. It confirmed one. That confirmation didn't stay confined to fashion. It crossed into adjacent spaces: media, philanthropy, entertainment. Anywhere visibility intersects with institutional control. The denial became shorthand, not for disgrace, not for failure, for friction. And friction is the one thing institutions are trained to eliminate. People often imagine power as something dramatic, loud, assertive. But most power today is exercised through quiet consensus, through shared understanding of what's easier, safer, less complicated, and once consensus shifts, it rarely shifts back. That's the part people underestimate. They assume relevance is elastic, that a strong enough presence can stretch it back into place. But elasticity requires cooperation, and cooperation dries up when the cost outweighs the benefit. One of the most telling reactions came from people who said nothing at all. People who, in previous years, would have reached out immediately, who would have framed the moment as a misunderstanding, who would have offered proximity as protection. They didn't, not because they suddenly disliked her, but because proximity had become a liability. That's the cruelest pivot of all, when association itself becomes something you manage instead of something you seek. And it doesn't happen because of one event. It happens because events accumulate. Paris was simply the clearest data point. The denial didn't force anyone to choose sides. It showed them where the boundary was. And once you know where the boundary is, you don't press against it unless you're willing to absorb the consequences. Most people aren't. So they adjust their behavior instead. This is where the public narrative diverges sharply from the private one. Publicly, nothing happened. Privately, everything shifted. That's why there was no outrage cycle, no viral backlash, no dramatic reframing. There was nothing to react to, just an absence. And absences are powerful because they don't demand resolution. They just linger. People begin to speak in hypotheticals. If she shows up, how will that land? If she's included, what does that signal? If she's excluded, who notices? Those questions reshape decisions long before they're ever asked directly. And that reshaping doesn't require malice. It requires fatigue, fatigue with complexity, fatigue with narratives that need unpacking, fatigue with attention that doesn't convert cleanly into benefit. By 2026, fatigue was the dominant mood in elite institutions. They wanted clean lines, clear optics, predictable outcomes. Paris Fashion Week's handling of that moment aligned perfectly with that mood, which is why it didn't feel controversial inside the system. It felt appropriate. That's a hard word to sit with, because appropriateness is a moral judgment disguised as neutrality. It implies a standard. And that standard had shifted. The most revealing part is that no one articulated the shift. It didn't need articulation. It was enforced once. And enforcement is the purest form of communication. From that point on, the question stopped being, why did this happen? The question became, what does this change? And the answer wasn't immediate, but it was cumulative. Every interaction afterward carried a trace of that moment. Every invitation was filtered through the memory of that door. Every potential appearance was weighed against the image of that tablet not lighting up. The system didn't need to punish further. It had already taught the lesson. That lesson wasn't about worth, it was about control. About who controls access, about who defines relevance, about who decides when a name no longer unlocks a space automatically. And once that lesson is learned, it's internalized. People stop testing the boundary. They assume it holds, which is exactly what happened next. Because in the weeks following Paris, something subtle but unmistakable occurred. Doors didn't slam shut. They simply didn't open. And no one explained why. That's when the recalibration moved from symbolic to structural, from one moment to a pattern, from a denial to a direction. And the next space where this pattern would surface wasn't public at all. It was behind closed doors, in conversations that would never be quoted, decisions that would never be attributed, and consequences that would only become visible much later. But when they did, the connection back to Paris would be impossible to ignore. Because that door didn't just stay closed, it taught others how and when to close theirs too. The easiest mistake to make here is to assume that the silence meant nothing happened. Silence, after all, feels like absence, like nothingness. But in elite systems, silence is rarely empty. It's usually crowded with decisions that no one wants attached to their name. After Paris, there was no announcement, no clarification, no quiet sources say corrections slipped to friendly outlets. And that wasn't an oversight. It was strategy. Because the moment you explain a boundary, you invite scrutiny. And scrutiny invites disagreement. And disagreement invites fractures. Silence avoids all of that. Silence lets the system move forward without defending itself. So while the public moved on, distracted by the next headline, the next look, the next controversy, something else was happening in parallel. A recalibration. It didn't look dramatic. It didn't come with memos stamped urgent. It came as subtle shifts in tone, in language, in timing. Responses took longer. Invitations became vaguer. Conversations that once felt warm became professional. That's how these transitions happen. Not overnight, not with a single decisive blow, but with a slow accumulation of friction, and friction changes behavior. One insider described it later as a cooling, not a cutoff. A temperature change you didn't notice until you realized the room felt different. That description matters, because cooling implies intent without hostility. It implies a decision to create distance without declaring it. And distance, once established, has a way of maintaining itself. The Paris moment gave cover to that distance. It provided a reference point everyone could quietly point to without saying it out loud. We saw what happened. No one needed to add more. This is where the idea of allies becomes complicated. People imagine alliances as fixed, as loyalty-based, as something you earn and keep. In reality, alliances at this level are situational. They exist as long as the situation makes sense. And when the situation changes, alliances don't break, they dissolve. No confrontation. No betrayal speech. Just absence. People stop reaching out. Stop looping you in. Stop assuming your presence will be welcomed. And because no one says why, you're left filling in the blanks yourself. That uncertainty is corrosive. It makes every interaction feel provisional. Is this meeting real or courtesy? Is this invitation firm or symbolic? Is this silence strategic or personal? When you can't answer those questions, your footing becomes unstable. That instability was the real consequence of Paris. Not embarrassment, not humiliation. Instability, because once access stops being predictable, everything else has to be renegotiated. And renegotiation is exhausting. One thing people often overlook is how much energy it takes to maintain relevance inside systems that are constantly reassessing you. When access is assumed, you don't think about it. When access is conditional, you think about nothing else. Every move becomes strategic, every appearance calculated, every absence overanalyzed. That mental load changes how you show up, and not always in ways that help. Here's another contradiction worth sitting with. From the outside, the denial looked small. A single moment, a brief inconvenience. From the inside, it reverberated, because inside elite systems, moments are not evaluated by their duration. They're evaluated by their signal strength. And this moment signaled that the system would no longer stretch itself to accommodate unpredictability. That's a powerful message. It doesn't just affect the person involved. It affects everyone watching, because everyone watching asks the same question. If it can happen to her, what about me? That question produces compliance. It produces self-censorship. It produces alignment, which is exactly what systems like this rely on. No enforcement mechanism is more effective than the fear of quiet exclusion. No one wants to be the next name that doesn't resolve on the tablet. So people adapt. They pull back. They choose safer associations. They align more tightly with institutional expectations. And that adaptation reinforces the boundary that caused it. It's a feedback loop. Paris was the trigger, but the loop sustained itself. There's a moment insiders often point to as the true turning point, and it didn't involve fashion at all. It involved scheduling. After Paris, calendars changed. Not dramatically, subtly. Meetings were postponed, then postponed again, then quietly dropped. Events that might have featured her presence were reframed, rebranded, reassigned. No one said no outright. They just stopped saying yes. And in systems that thrive on momentum, stopping momentum is decisive. Momentum creates inevitability. Lose momentum and everything feels optional. Optional is dangerous because optional things are easy to deprioritize. This is where the narrative becomes harder to track from the outside because nothing explodes. Nothing collapses. There's no single moment you can point to and say, that's when it ended. Instead, there's a gradual thinning. Fewer touch points, less urgency, more distance. And distance creates its own logic. People start assuming you're less central, less involved, less relevant. Those assumptions then inform future decisions. It's not malicious, it's efficient. And efficiency is the ultimate value here. What Paris did was remove the illusion that access was guaranteed. Once that illusion shattered, everything else followed naturally. People didn't need to coordinate. They didn't need to conspire. They just needed to respond rationally to new information. And the new information was clear. The system was no longer bending. Which raises an unsettling possibility. What if Paris wasn't the cause, but the confirmation? What if the recalibration had already happened, quietly, incrementally, and Paris was simply the first place it became impossible to ignore? That interpretation changes everything. It suggests that the denial wasn't proactive. It was reactive, a response to a pattern that had already solidified. If that's the case, then the real story isn't about Fashion Week at all. It's about the moment when institutions stop treating someone as a priority. And priority is not about affection or approval. It's about usefulness. When someone stops being useful to a system's goals, the system doesn't attack them. It detaches. That detachment is subtle. It looks like professionalism, It sounds like politeness. It feels like nothing is happening until you realize how much has changed. The silence after Paris wasn't empty. It was full of recalculations that no one needed to announce. And once those recalculations took hold, reversing them would have required effort. Effort no one was motivated to expend, because the system had already adapted, which leads us to the next phase of this story. Because while the public saw a single denial, insiders saw a green light. Not to attack, but to disengage. And disengagement spreads faster than outrage ever could. The next space where this disengagement would surface wasn't glamorous. It wasn't visible, it was procedural. And when it surfaced there, it would make clear that Paris wasn't an anomaly. It was precedent. And precedents, once set, are powerful because they don't just describe what happened. They define what's allowed to happen next. And what happened next would confirm that the boundary drawn in Paris wasn't temporary. It was directional. Precedent is a dangerous thing when it's quiet. Loud precedents get challenged. Quiet ones get copied. And what Paris established, without ever saying so, was a template, not a punishment, not a rejection, but a method, a way of withdrawing recognition without incurring backlash, a way of stepping back without ever appearing to step away. That template didn't stay in Paris. It traveled, not as gossip, not as warning, as reassurance. Reassurance to institutions that had been hesitating, to decision makers who had been unsure whether pulling back would look aggressive or petty or politically risky. Paris answered that for them. It showed that withdrawal could be clean, professional, nearly invisible. And once people saw that, they stopped hesitating. This is where the story shifts from observation to consequence. Because the next phase didn't involve doors or entrances or public-facing events at all. It involved paperwork, calendars, budgets, commitments that exist entirely off camera. Those are the spaces where reputations actually harden. If you want to understand how power is exercised now, stop looking at runways and start looking at scheduling software. That's where the next signals appeared. The first changes were easy to miss. A meeting that moved from confirmed to tentative, a proposal that stalled in review, a collaboration that stayed under discussion longer than it should have. None of these things on their own mean anything. Together, they form a pattern. And patterns are how institutions talk to each other. People who work inside these systems don't need memos. They read timing, tone, responsiveness. They notice when enthusiasm cools. They notice when replies become formal. They notice when names are mentioned less frequently in rooms where they used to anchor conversations. After Paris, those shifts accelerated, not because anyone was instructed to pull back, but because pulling back now felt permissible. The taboo had been broken. Paris had demonstrated that you could do this quietly and nothing would happen. No scandal, no backlash, no destabilizing headlines, which removed the final obstacle. Up until that point, hesitation had been driven by uncertainty. Would this look bad? Would this be misinterpreted? Would it provoke a response? Paris answered all of that. It looked fine. It passed. It didn't provoke anything. That's when disengagement stopped being theoretical and became operational. Here's where the human part of this gets uncomfortable. People assume that when access is withdrawn, the person affected is immediately aware of it. That's rarely true. What happens instead is a slow erosion of certainty. You start noticing that follow-ups take longer, that familiar names aren't copied anymore, that conversations feel more transactional. And because no one tells you what's changed, you're left guessing. Did I miss something? Is this temporary? Am I overreading this? That self-doubt is not accidental. It's a byproduct of systems that want to avoid confrontation. By not naming the shift, they place the burden of interpretation on the individual. And interpretation is exhausting. It forces you to constantly reassess your standing, to second-guess every interaction, to wonder whether pushing for clarity would make things worse, which often leads to restraint. And restraint, paradoxically, reinforces the withdrawal. Because silence is interpreted as acceptance. This is how relevance decays in the modern era. Not with a scandal, with 1,000 micro-adjustments that all move in the same direction. Paris wasn't the first micro-adjustment. It was the first visible one. And visibility matters because it gives everyone else permission to follow suit. One executive described it later as a relief, not relief that someone had been excluded. Relief that the ambiguity was gone. Ambiguity is costly. It requires ongoing negotiation. Clarity allows systems to move forward, and clarity arrived the moment security didn't budge. That moment settled the internal debate. After that, the question wasn't, should we engage? It was, is there a reason to? And when that's the framing, the answer often defaults to no. This is where the concept of liability enters the picture. Not in the legal sense, but in the strategic one. A liability isn't someone who causes harm. It's someone whose involvement requires explanation. Explanation consumes resources. Resources are finite. So institutions start optimizing. They choose paths that require the least narrative management. And once someone is categorized, even informally, as requiring management, they're deprioritized, not shunned, just sidelined. Paris functioned as the data point that